Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the webinar, Fueling the Debate. We're going to be discussing the risk management trends in energy. Just a quick note to listeners, if you cannot hear us, well, you won't be hearing this message, but if you can't hear us, it's not our end, it would be your end. So hopefully you can hear us. We are joined by a panel, which we will get to a bit later on. So I'm just going to introduce the agenda in a second. I just thought I'd let you know that I'll be chairing this event. My name is Alexander Larsen. I'm a certified fellow of the Institute of Risk Management. I'm also president of Baldwin Global Risk Services, and I am one of the Institute of Risk Management trainers. I also chair the new Energy Special Interest Group, so I really hope that many of you watching this or listening in will seek to join the Energy Special Interest Group. We have a lot of good plans for it, and we hope to get contributions from as many people as possible. The agenda for today, I'm just going to introduce the report. The report was based on a survey, and then we got a lot of interesting contributions from IRM members in the industry. So I'll introduce the main findings from that report. I'm also I've highlighted the new Energy Special Interest Group. I really hope you join this group. We want as many members as possible. All the experience we can get to share ideas will be perfect. There's an energy quiz on the website as well, just to sort of get people interested and motivated for a new training course, which has been launched as well, the oil and gas training course. Whilst not energy industry related, it is oil and gas specific related. And it covers much of the fundamentals of risk management course, but it adds the oil and gas industry specific aspect and has case studies around oil and gas. All of this you can find on the website www.theirm.org. And as you can see on the screen if you're watching, the Fueling the Debate publication is also available online, and it has all the results of the survey and more, and that's what we will be discussing today. We have an option for questions from the audience. So we will take some questions. The panel will take some questions at the end. So if you do have questions, please feel free to add your questions in the panel available in the Bright Talk page. So the agenda is as follows. We will have myself covering the major findings of the report. We'll then go on to have a panel discussion who will discuss those main findings. Dominic Antonucci is also going to be speaking about moving up the risk maturity curve, which was a specific contribution to the report with its own sort of section. And he will be just covering a little bit about that, and he will also form part of the panel discussion. And then finally, we'll have the Q&As if there are any questions that we have from the audience. So to kick off, we ran a survey and we received responses from over 50 oil and gas companies from around the globe. And that really pushed forward the publication. The publication was initially just going to be a thought leadership publication, but we did think that by sending out a survey, getting feedback from the industry itself, it would add much more value when we looked at how do we put together this publication. So what we have is that we have the initial or the high-level findings, which are really focused about what will the main areas of focus be for your organization in the coming years. And what we found was, interestingly, companies are still looking to reduce costs. They're still looking at efficiencies, organizational efficiencies. Yet at the same time, they are looking towards new projects. So it seems to me that there's a transition whereby, yes, we're still trying to cut costs and be more efficient with our spending, but we do feel the time is right to take on new projects. Surprisingly, renewable energies was not quite as high as we might have expected. The main areas of focus with regards to risk management were around enterprise risk management, project risk management, financial risk, and also operational and technical safety. But business continuity featured there as well. In fact, most aspects of risk management people suggested they would be focusing on. The highest one was project risk and operational technical safety. But generally they were all high, which indicates positively that we will be focusing on risk and risk-related management going forward. One of the questions we asked was, which standard do you follow? And we gave them a few standards to choose between: ISO 31000, the Australian Risk Management Standard. We also had things such as COSO. And as you'll see, ISO 31000 has nearly 80% of the companies following it. COSO was the next largest. However, it was quite a significant sort of advantage to ISO 31000. It will be interesting to hear the view of the panel when we get to that. One of the questions we asked, where do the biggest risks come from? And unsurprisingly, strategic risk was at the very top with 61%. Those were the sort of the critical risks came from strategic risks. And operations was closely behind. The rest, people risk, that also featured highly, which again is very positive. People risk in the past has probably been forgotten, the human factor, but that seems to be picking up now amongst organizations who realize that people are a critical aspect of their organization and are part of the risk profile. You might not be able to see this. It's quite detailed, this one. It basically covered what were the biggest risks in the next 5 years to your organization. And I can tell you that the largest ones were oil price, and they were also, and oil price was the real driver, but also things such as skills gap and global economy. Those came out on top. Cyber attack, much less so. There's been a lot of talk about cyber-related risk recently, but this did not feature that highly on this report. And then one last question I would like to cover that we asked was, do you have an enterprise risk management software solution? Most organizations said, no, we don't. Again, I was quite surprised at this result. I expected it to more companies to have risk management software solutions, but in the end, it looks like it's a 60-40 split to the no. Sorry, there was one more question, which was, are there business continuity plans? And many said there were already in place. There were also many that said, well, somewhat in place. And then there was about 20% looking at, well, we plan on putting it in place over the coming couple of years. So that was the high-level findings, and this is exactly what the panel will be discussing. Now, on this screen, Samuel is not with us, unfortunately. However, Dominic will be with us on this panel. And what I would like to do is I will ask each individual panel member just to introduce themselves. And I'll start with Rahat, if you would like to just introduce yourself, a bit about your experience.
Good morning, good afternoon, everybody, depending on which part of the globe you're in. I'm Rahat Latif. I'm Head of Enterprise Risk and Business Continuity Management here at Qatar Gas. So I've been with Qatar Gas for approximately 12 years. Started with as project manager for one of the big LNG construction projects, and then move over to corporate to start up the IRM department at that time, and really introduced IRM and BCM to Qatar Gas. That's in a brief nutshell. Prior to coming here in Qatar, I was mostly in the UK on various projects ranging from transport to health to government, primarily in risk and program management. So that's a very, very brief overview of where I sit today.
That's great. Thanks, Rahat. And we also have Mark Bolt here, Director at DNV Global. If you'd like to introduce yourself.
Oh yes, this is Mark Bolt here. I will correct that. It's actually DNVGL. That's the name of the company. I've been in the risk world since the 1980s and a chartered fellow of the Institute of Risk Management, working predominantly with oil and gas and process industries, but also doing work in other industries, including the likes of healthcare and rail. And most of the work I do today is with companies who are operating in the oil and gas and process industry world, applying and undertaking their risk assessments, helping them with developing their risk management systems and the like.
Thank you, Mark. We have another presenter that's just joined us. Samuel, is that yourself?
Yeah, Samuel Kibara, yes.
Hi. I was just introducing the panelists and asking them to introduce themselves. So you came at perfect timing. If you'd like to introduce yourself, just your background.
Okay. Yes, my name is Samuel Kibara. I'm based in Nairobi, Kenya, that is in East Africa. And I am a certified fellow of the Institute of Risk Management. And I work as a consultant. I consult with organizations in the area of enterprise risk management and business continuity management, as well as business process analysis. So I have been working in the oil and the energy sector in the region, and I have quite some vast experience in risk management within the electricity subsector.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And then Dominic, do you want to just introduce yourself as well?
Yes, thank you. I'm Dominic Antonucci. I'm a chartered member of IRM and a C-Risk certified. I'm a former Shell strategic planner who's been focusing for the last dozen years internationally as a chief risk officer and also a marsh risk consultant. In recent years, I'm an independent risk advisor consulting across the Middle East, Europe and other regions. And I've written a couple of books specializing in risk maturity for cyber and for enterprise risk management. Over.
Thank you very much. And finally, Grant, would you like to introduce yourself? Grant Griffith.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. Hi, I'm Grant. I've worked in the energy sector for well over 20 years now, mainly on energy infrastructure developments, trading and risk management engagements and business transformation around oil and gas and utilities companies, and pretty much working everywhere from Australia right across the EMEA region. Worked as a project manager, divisional general manager for some large engineering and construction companies, and also worked on a lot of the energy market regulatory change programs in the UK, Europe and around Australasia. These days I do consultancy, mainly focusing on IRM and governance transformation and predominantly for energy companies. That tends to be the majority of the work that I do. The other thing I do in my spare time when I have any is chairing the Institute of Risk Management's Turkey Regional Group, and that's always fun, and we're seeing a lot of growing interest in risk management in this part of the world.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Okay, so that's the panel, and it's not quite the same chairing a panel session when you're face-to-face with everyone and everyone can see when someone is about to speak. So what I'd like to do first is maybe just get insight from each of the panel members first individually on what their view of those high-level findings are. Did it come as a surprise? Is it something that was expected, or any other views that they might have? So if we could start with Rahat, what were your views on what the report concluded with and the findings that it came out with?
Well, I think I would say that, firstly, there are no surprises, right? I think that's the first thing. It's maybe, like you said, on software, but maybe you can come to that. That's the one thing. So no big surprises. And the second thing I'd like to point out is that although we've got different areas and areas mentioned there, a lot of them are just so interrelated. So, for example, on your biggest risks, the three: oil price, skills gap, global economy, they're all linked. The global economy affects the oil price. The oil price affects investment, and then projects, and then manpower. And then if you shed too much manpower, you've got to think about the skills gap in the future. That's one example. If you look at your findings on cost reduction, well, again, so if the global economy is an issue, then there's a focus on cost reduction and on efficiency. So those two both featured highly, cost reduction and efficiency. But then again, the sector is very conscious about the future and staying efficient and finding new and new projects in often very harder and harder terrain. So the new project gets a listing as well, new territories and new projects. So there's always there's a continuous focus on the business cycle has an impact on this global industry. The oil price, of course, has a big impact in terms of investment and in terms of focus. But at the same time, companies are very wary of staying efficient and preparing for the future. So new projects and new territories are always going to be important. Just going through some of the other, so project risk management was mentioned. Of course, new projects and new territories mean that focus on project risks. So I'm not surprised that gets a mention, as does operational and technical safety. That's a core value for most oil and gas companies, is operational efficiency and being safe. So I'm not surprised again that's there, and so is business continuity. It gets a mention in terms of the focus areas. But it is, I guess, when it comes to the 40% that have said they've got something in place, and the 60% that have said they're either planning or doing, that's a little disappointing, I think, for an industry that's as important as this, and also in terms of the kind of like it's a production plant. So production plants often have single, little redundancy. So having a robust IRM and BCM is actually paramount. So I'm getting a bit surprised with that one, that only 40% have plans in place. So maybe that's one surprise. And I said earlier on there's no surprises. That's probably one. On the software side, I'm not surprised with that. I would imagine that a lot of the no's were about, well, we do have software, but maybe we don't have one software which is integrating and all singing and dancing. What we probably have is a multitude of different systems which are specialist for, specific for for each area. So PR, project risk, we probably have something, and for financial risk, we probably have something. And there's one for collecting all the data, which we call the IRM, but probably not one solution for the whole company, which a lot of I know there are some vendors which promote those. So I mean that's kind of like my brief overview on the report.
Excellent. Thank you, Rahat. Mark, do you have anything to add?
I'll make a few comments. I think the cost reduction, organisational efficiency would align to a lot of what I am seeing with oil and gas companies, with them also looking at how they can use digitisation to be more effective in their work, and new ways of working with contractors to keep costs down. I think that to me anyway, a lot of the companies are now have reduced their cost base so that they can run at the current oil prices. They are probably in a better position to cope with oil price fluctuations, certainly going downwards, obviously, than they were a few years ago when the oil price went over $100 a barrel. I think if I look at some of the other things which I think are interesting to see, clearly operations and technical safety are a key issue. It's come out in one of the charts, but they also, when you talked about the risks for the next 2 to 5 years, it's interesting how many of them said that major accidents are not a significant risk in the future. But it was also at the same time interesting to see there was a significant number who thought they were. And there was quite a spread on that, perhaps more so than other areas. And I would have expected to see more to the higher end, but maybe they feel they've got a lot of things under control, and it is probably an area where most oil and gas companies have a lot of focus. The other thing I thought in the terms of the risk views, it was interesting to see how when you talk about risk as a whole across many organisations, everybody talks about cyber. This is actually down as a lower risk over the next 2 to 5 years for many of the oil companies who responded to things. And a bit like the comments just made, I think there probably are a multitude of different types of risk tools being used, software tools being used within organisations, and it's perhaps not uniform across everybody. I hope that gives sort of a little bit of my thoughts, which are useful to others.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Mark. Samuel, you have perhaps a slightly different view coming from a very specific region that most of the other panelists are not based specifically in that region. What's your views of the findings?
Thank you. I would say, like most of my colleagues, not anything. There wasn't major surprises that I would pick up, but I for one, looking at the sector, I was a retro surprise, because from where I'm coming from, I know for a long time project risk management vis-a-vis the entire risk management, enterprise risk management has been quite a back and forth quite a bit. But it was surprising to see that there is quite a bit of focus into that area of project risk. Going down to the biggest risks. From the side we are coming from, the oil and gas sector is not so huge in terms of to control the issues to do with the oil price. But I'm coming from a region that is recently getting into a bit of oil and gas, and it is interesting to see that the key risks that would have imagined in any other sector, things like cyber, things like disruption, are not featuring very, very high areas would have thought, although they have a significant thing. But it was interesting to see that things like major accident, especially because accidents in the oil and gas can be quite catastrophic. I think that's likely to be something that will change the way we view things around, because we have not had a very active oil and gas sector, and on the electricity subsector, those tend to be a retro, be more managed. I noted the issues of natural disaster getting quite up there. And then, yes, lastly, I thought the issue of the software and BCM, I expected perhaps there would be more of, I don't know whether this mentions the whole issue of real automation, all, like my colleague says there, is it just a specific type of software? And quite a big percentage of organizations without BCM is quite of a surprise, especially in our sector. So that would be my input into the report findings.
Thanks very much, Samuel. Yes, I think I think the business continuity perspective is quite surprising, and there could be a number of reasons for that, the way that the question was asked in the survey, or the fact that, yes, maybe we have it well down in operations, but maybe not up at the sort of higher level in terms of business continuity that deals with the media and so forth.
Yes.
Dominic, do you have any comments?
Yes, and perhaps I'll be a little bolder or harsher than my colleagues. I was a little disappointed and quite surprised at particularly the maturity ratings. I'm staggered to see that it's an average middling rating for ERM and even worse for BCM. I can understand higher ratings for safety and the more traditional categories of risk management systems, but I'm really disappointed at how middling those levels are. Staggered that cyber is back there. How people in O&G can think that after the Iran attack on their operations, after the attack in Saudi Arabia on oil and gas there, that just staggers me. I think, and when I look at various other more specific indicators to do with that indicate maturity, like risk function budgets, I mean, they are extremely small to modest. Budgets for risk training, extremely small to modest. I'm way more concerned than before the survey that oil and gas is resting on their laurels, so to speak, especially given that the sector has so much of a history, sophistication, management talent, and the sort of resources it has access to. I would expect a lot more effort going into gap improvement on their risk maturity capabilities, especially for ERM and BCM, but also for cyber. Now, the good news is that, there's plenty of research over the last 15 years that perhaps we, on the risk management support function side, should be promoting better with the front line and top management, that there are many hard proven economic benefits to improving risk maturity, whether it's on the value of the business, the firm valuation, revenue gains, EBITDA gains, etc. So I think without staying on the negatives, looking at the positives, there is so much room for improvement that oil and gas can embrace over.
Thanks very much. I appreciate your comments, and I think that is an important factor here, is to take away, well, what are the positives? And I think it's clear that they do their core business very well. It's a risky industry, and they do focus on that. But as you say, going forward from an enterprise risk point of view, there seems to be a lot of work to do. Grant, what about yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Some interesting observations. First of all, I'd like to preface my comments by saying this is very helpful as a report, because the number of times I've talked to organisations, and probably the first question I get is, is there any benchmarking out there for energy companies? How do we compare to others? Where would we be on a scale of 1 to 5 in terms of ERM maturity or capability? And so this is a step in the right direction, the report, and providing a starting point as a benchmark. It's a very constructive piece of work. So congratulations to everyone who was involved in putting this together. It's much needed and very welcome. So that helps to sort of answer that question and get some consistency and a starting point around the benchmarking question that organisations have. The thing that was interesting for me, the other question that I get asked quite a bit is, what standards or which standards should we be looking at for ERM? So, and this is my personal point of view, but I'm pleased to see that ISO 31000 has almost 80% acceptance. So I think that's a step in the right direction to at least saying, or at least providing a sound argument for saying, hey, there is a de facto standard out there. So that saves organisations a lot of time on their ERM journey. Okay, we can comfortably adapt ISO 31000 as a starting point, and let's go from there as a standard to use. So very helpful in that respect, this report. It adds a lot of value to the industry, so that's great. I echo Dominic's thoughts about the maturity rating for ERM. I thought it would be a bit higher in some places. But again, all of this, I suppose, has to be put into the context of the profile and diversity of the organisations who responded. So I suppose if we drill down into some of that underlying data, we get a feel for why these results are saying what they're saying. Rahat made an interesting point earlier on about the interrelated nature of the risks, and that's something I've picked up on as well. Now, project risk management having a high focus, yeah, and I think that's an example of where there's quite a few things coming into play there. There's a lot of drivers like innovation and change, regulatory, and when I say innovation and change, people, process and technology. And I think there are a number of projects underway in organisations all around the world where they're addressing all of those things. So perhaps they're seeing it from the point of view of project risk management becomes more important than some of the other elements. Organisational efficiency, getting gains there, nothing surprising there from my experience anyway. I think that's about as expected. Now, strategic being the biggest risk, that's understandable. But yeah, I was a little surprised that it was so high and some others weren't quite as high. But again, this will be perhaps the way that organisations are responding to the survey and the way that they're interpreting the questions in their own mind. Renewables and green energy. Well, I'm surprised that that's not higher up, but then when I look at it again, it does say green energy focus. And to me that says that with green energy, I think a number of organisations now have gone through that, let's say, that initial disruption of moving a bit more towards green technologies and renewable energy. So I think that they probably put that a little bit behind them now, and as they look forward on the next 2 to 5 years, that they're probably a little bit less concerned about that, and they're a little bit more concerned about implementing projects to improve things, about getting a handle on organisational efficiency and various other things. I also think it probably comes under strategic as well. Maybe organisations are now moving a little bit further forward and saying, hey, some of these things are now within our strategic purview. So they're saying we've got a lot of the sort of focus on getting some things in place. Now, strategically, with regulation and technologies and other things, execution of that strategy going forward over 2 to 5 years becomes a much bigger focus for us. And on the question of risk management systems, I think Rahat sort of indicated this point, and I think it really leans towards exposing a somewhat siloed approach in there. In fact, I think a number of the panelists have sort of alluded to that we're still very siloed, and ERM is not yet there. Now, if we were to look at organisations with quite a major trading activity, you'd find that perhaps the recognition or the understanding or the belief that systems are much more advanced and much more widely used would probably be a much higher percentage. Now, it may not be ERM systems per se, but perhaps the perception within the organisation would be that that's a move towards ERM. So I think there's a lot of siloing out there. So purely, I suppose if we put it in an ERM context, it just shows that ERM is not yet there as a fully integrated enterprise, holistic activity. That's probably the key things for me.
Excellent. Thank you very much for your comments. Some interesting insights there. I appreciate your view as well on why maybe renewables didn't get as high a priority. As you say, maybe it's already been figured into their strategy already, and therefore they're looking past that now. A few interesting views from everyone. We have a few comments, for example, on the major accidents. Why is that so low? The fact that there is the skills gap. I heard about digitization as well. That got a mention. I think the key takeaway is a surprise around business continuity and potentially software. I'd like to, before I do get into some questions, I'd like to remind everyone listening in or watching that they can post questions within this Bright Talk website and for the panel so that they can answer any questions you might have. I'd like to get... Sorry.
Something. Can I just come in?
Yeah.
Yeah. I just want to echo what's been said about the major accident and cyber. I think Dominic highlighted those. I'd agree with him, actually. I'm looking at that table again. I just wonder whether the question was understood, because I feel the same. I can't understand why they're high issues now, but they will fall over the next 4 years. I just don't see that happening with cyber security. It's a continuous threat. I don't see it falling in any shape or form. And the same with major accidents. That's always a big concern for oil and gas companies, and they always have to be on top. So I don't see that falling either. I just wonder whether the question was misunderstood. I don't see how that can be high now and falling in future years.
So why don't we discuss this? We've heard about the cyber risk, but also digitization in a way of efficiencies. What does the panel think? Because obviously cyber risk has now been raised a few times. How is it quite so low? But also we heard about the digitization. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that. Does anyone want to sort of add their views on this?
Okay, can I just come in with a couple of points at smart bolts here? I think that there is a trend to looking at more, you could say, remote operations, where you would have oil wells which are controlled at a distance, and you can get to the concepts of not normally manned facilities. And that is going to require greater use, an increasing use, you could say, of the IT systems to do those controls. I think that's where you would then have the potential for cyber attacks that could influence your operations, either through stopping operations and or creating problems with the operations which may result in major accidents. And similarly, if you've got systems which are using a lot more software, you're going to have to manage the upgrading and changing of that software. And we may know when we've had upgrades of things like Microsoft software that sometimes it gives you some glitches, and sometimes you upgrade one bit of software because it interacts with another, it causes problems. I'm not saying that will happen with the sort of the control systems, but we need to be aware that that is an issue that will need to be managed going forward from a risk point of view, as well as having more systems which people could potentially attack. On things. So I think that's what comes in. Digitization I see as also coming in a different way. To me, the digitization is to get better understanding and knowledge. You could argue this going to the big data concept, to help people to improve the ways perhaps they are getting oil out the ground, so they can use it within their sort of geophysics and geology world to identify what to go after. And to improve the quality, basically the effectiveness of their operations, to get more oil out than perhaps they were before, and to be more focused and targeted on where they're perhaps going for in reservoirs and the likes. As well as getting information perhaps on maintenance and effectiveness of maintenance and inspection, and using digitization to help improve uptime and reduce the chance of things going wrong.
Thank you. Anyone want to add to that or comment?
Dominic here. Yeah, look, just on the cyber side, in the report, I've republished a PwC client survey from around the same period. And unfortunately, it shows that if oil and gas is considered as part of energy, of the 18 sectors, it was in the bottom third, which again, to me, is staggering in terms of cyber risk maturity, and also in terms of general risk culture maturity. So here's not just our survey, but another reputable survey of quite a large number, showing the same sort of thing. Over.
Interesting.
Do you think it could have something to do with not necessarily understanding what cyber risk actually means, as in, well, we have virus protection, we have IT dealing with this, we're dealing with hackers, it's never happened to us. Okay, yes, there's been major incidents, but they're few and far between. I don't know. It seems to maybe be that people think it's overhyped, or what are your views?
I think you're right, Alex. I think there is an element of that, and I recently heard it from a client a couple of months ago. Oh yeah, it's okay. No, it's not an issue. And I said, well, even if you think it's not, perhaps a little bit more scenario analysis and a little bit more workshopping on this, just to uncover any weaknesses or potential weaknesses as your business model changes and as your take-up rate of technology and digitization moves ahead, it's going to change. And, I often wonder if the whole mindset around, and, Dominic, you mentioned a very important word there, culture. It's culture, and it's also the other thing we say in risk management, saying from the top, who's the custodian of this? Who's driving this within the organisation? Because if we look at organisations like the IOD, what's one of the biggest concerns year in, year out for the last few years from boards of directors? Cyber risk and cyber attack. So that's obviously not translating across necessarily into all of the energy sector for some reason.
Yeah, it's Rahat here. Both those surveys do surprise me, given that the amount of engagement we have with, major oil and gas companies and the priority that the effort that goes into cybersecurity. So those are very surprising. An element of cybersecurity for oil and gas companies and other process plant companies is in industrial control systems and their security. And I think I just wonder whether, if the question was posed on threats to industrial control systems as opposed to the perception that cybersecurity means corporate IT, I wonder if the answers might have been different. Because I do think there is a lot of focus on industrial control systems, cybersecurity in the oil and gas sector from our, certainly from where I see happening with my colleagues in the industry.
I'd like to link this as well into the business continuity. So we're just talking about cyber risk here, and the fact that it can impact reputation, for example, as can major accidents, which again featured quite low. So major accidents, you've got cyber risk, both potentially hitting reputation and continuity of business, and at the same time, we're seeing there seems to be less companies that are sort of driving business continuity, according to the survey. So what are your views on that? Is there a correlation?
I could comment on that.
Great, please do.
On the business continuity side, from the experience from organizations, perhaps not necessarily in the oil and gas, has a way that the perception of the risk depends on when we last had a big incident happening within the oil and gas or within the energy sector, and when the periods after we have had a major incident seem to push organizations to a high alertness and just a bit of wanting to think about the preparedness in terms of continuity and all that. And it is surprising. I don't know whether it's purely perceptive or is a maturity of feeling that we have covered all, which I don't think would be a very true representation in regard to the high investments that would be required to ensure that we do have, for example, redundant systems around some critical areas. So perhaps it's just a general fearing. Perhaps we have not had a very major, incident that would jolt people to start thinking about things that could threaten the existence. Perhaps that could explain why it seems to be, scoring pretty low, which is pretty a surprise.
Thank you. Anyone want to add anything there?
Just quickly on BCM, I did a little bit of digging behind the data, Alex, behind that one and several of the others. On the BCM, there does appear to be, I think, a misunderstanding or a disconnect in understanding between the respondents, because across the whole group, their average maturity score for BCM was 60%, a score of 3.0 across the whole group. And yet, on the other hand, nearly the same percentage, 58%, said that they don't have it in place. I don't know how the same group of respondents could reconcile those two things. I suspect that the 60% not in place is probably more accurate, and the maturity self-assessment was perhaps optimistically upscored. Over.
Thanks. I've got a question from the audience just asking where they can find the survey. This is the Fueling the Debate publication. If you go to www.theirm.org, on their main page, there is a Knowledge and Resources tab, and if you click on that, you're trying to find Thought Leadership, which should be on the left side, and within that you will see Fueling the Debate, and you'll be able to download the publication there. Again, that's the IRM.org, and you want to go to Knowledge and Resources, Thought Leadership, and you should find it there. Okay, so I'd just like to now move on to just ask a question about software. Now, obviously there's a lot of reasons why software may or may not be being used. I suppose the question I have is, what is everyone's thought on having enterprise risk management software versus, for example, having Excel or even some in-house solution?
It's Grant here.
Yeah.
I was going to say the first step is make sure you understand your processes. I have organisations sometimes but when they don't have their processes well understood and clearly defined and a good handle on their data, they're on a hard into nothing. So make sure you've got everything to a point you're comfortable with, then consider what software needs you have.
Excellent. Yeah, so what you're suggesting is get it right first. Understand what's working within your organization, where you want to go with regards to risk management. Once that's in place, once you've got the data coming in, you can then choose a software that will be fit for purpose, essentially.
Yeah, Dominic here. Absolutely agree with both of you there. For example, one of my current clients, very large diversified group, 18 different business units. They have the world's most expensive IRM software, but that's only for the more established business units that have understood their processes and have been working them through for quite a few years. Most of the business units are still working with .doc watch lists and .xls spreadsheets until their management and key decision makers can get their head around understanding risk management, and then they can progress in natural due course.
Hi, Rahat here. I'd concur with all the comments so far. I would say, yeah, absolutely have your process buttoned down. But I think that one of the issues in this sector and in any sector is that change within organizations, organizational changes, mergers, demergers, those sort of things. They produce process changes. So when you're in that situation, then it's practicality leads you to, this software is no longer applicable because it applied to a different configuration. Now we have to either deconfigure it or go back to Excel base, and that happens. I mean, that happened in our own organization as well. I think secondly, again, speaking from experience, I'd say don't overcomplicate it. There's a tendency to actually put absolutely every part of the process in there, and that in itself is a risk. Overcomplicating is a risk, because at the end of the day, it's got to be usable. I think usability is more important than having absolutely everything automated. If you can get your users, risk owners, risk managers to actually use it, that should be the aim. Then you're making progress. And my third comment is that make sure you get a consultant who's done it before. I can't overemphasize that as well. Experience does play a big part. I think if you get a consultant who has done it before in an organization similar to yours, then they're really adding value and can advise on the way that you get it configured. That's been my experience on systems.
Thank you. Does anyone have anything else to comment? I've got another question I'd like to ask, but if anyone else wants to just chime in, feel free.
Can I just come in quickly? I think the advantage of software is you get your one database, and that gives you digitization potential. So I'm just thinking that there are organizations who have been able to use the software they have. Maybe it's more on the accident reporting, but still links into the risk management tools as a whole, to understand the barriers or controls that failed for various reported incidents, and to use that then to start to prioritize how they will improve the management of their risk going forward to go after the various controls. So I've seen them literally go in, analyze the whole lot from the data. So you couldn't have really done that out of a number of different spreadsheets spread around the way, or at least not as easily. But I would agree with what everybody said, is understand your processes and then get the software to support the way you work. And I have seen organizations where they step through building up what they use in the way of the software tools to support risk management, whether that be introducing a sort of an accident reporting system and then adding in risk reporting to it work, and then doing some work on barrier management and building the modules up around that to help them have the dashboard and the likes to help manage the risk.
Thank you. Can I just also ask if you could put your phones on mute when someone is speaking, because there's a little bit of background noise, conscious of people listening in. Okay, so then I would just like to ask a final question, which is, we talked about skills, well, it's two questions. We talked about skills gap, and I'm just wondering, what do you feel the skills gap risk actually is? And is it something that the industry has created itself by just cutting people when the going got tough and then maybe struggling to get them back, or people retiring? Or I'd really like your views on that. But also, if this survey was presented in regions, do you think there would be a big difference in results? Obviously, we don't have the hard data based on how we've presented, but what's your feelings based on talking to various clients around the globe?
On the skills side, I think that there is some truth in the statement that after the oil price crashed and there were a lot of people who left the industry, that was a loss of knowledge to the industry, and you can't say it's necessarily it was sort of purposefully done, because it wasn't, but it's a consequence of cutting costs back. I think there is work. I mean, we do work knowledge management throughout the industry to try and capture and knowledge and to make it readily available, and that also fits into sort of the digitization world. Certainly, like as Shell have done a lot of knowledge management with their ROC system, retention of critical knowledge system. I don't think I can answer the regional one quite as well as some of the others, but the work I have done around the world makes me feel things are pretty consistent. But that's possibly because when you work with an international organisation, you get an international view. It may be different between more organisations with local activity. I'll pass on for somebody else to comment.
Thank you.
think on the schools there has been cutting costs over many years. And I think that the first thing, in my experience anyway, is, CFOs, and I'm sorry if I offend any CFOs who may be on this webinar, but they tend to say, how much money can we save this year? Where can we cut costs? And it becomes very easy for line managers to say, oh, we can cut back the training budget. And I think we're starting to see the results of that over a number of years. One other thing I would say, this big drive we've had in recent years towards more diversity in the workplace, I'm going to be very honest and say our energy industry, it's very male-dominated. And perhaps we need to see how we, and I know there's all the STEM initiatives all around the world to bring more women, from young girls and women into having more interest in science and technology and mathematics and these sorts of subjects. But I think we're also suffering from that a little bit. A friend of mine, he's just recently retired early. He was VP of a very large global organisation. He was VP of HR. And I said, what are you going to do next? And he said to me, well, I've got the one problem. I'm pale, I'm male, and I'm stale. And what we're seeing now is another retrenchment of people and experience and skills in the workplace. So I think we've got a lot of factors at play here. We are still losing experience in a number of industries around the world, especially in energy. But I think as we see this diversity move kick in years to come, hopefully we'll start to address that. And just one other point, in terms of ERM, purely in terms of ERM now, as ERM is embraced by more and more organisations, there's going to be a greater demand, and there is currently a greater demand for experienced risk practitioners, and they are a scarcity. So that also probably plays into the skills gap a little bit.
Thank you. Anyone else want to?
Yeah, if I could comment, perhaps from the African region, this would be perhaps pretty different. If to answer your question, if it was to be presented in on a region to region, of course, in Africa we are seeing a few emerging oil and gas areas, especially in the East Africa region, and the knowledge and the skill gap is huge. It's really it's a very very a market that is in making some very baby steps, and the skill gaps in the oil and gas are huge. And I would agree with just my previous person who mentioned and said, even in terms of risk management within the energy sector, whether it is oil and gas and the rest energy sector, we already seeing a lot of and a skill gap in that, even for personally myself, seeing a lot of requests coming from different countries within the region, just seeking someone who has a bit of knowledge on oil and gas and just the energy sector and the workings from the risk perspective. So if that was to be just looked into a wholesale of all the other aspects of the oil and gas sector, then you would perhaps realize that there is a real skill gap in Africa, and I think that's going to be a big issue going forward, even as the sector expands. Over.
Thank you very much, Anil. That's a really interesting insight from your region. Thank you. Does anyone else want to add to anything? Okay, well, I just wanted to highlight a couple of things. So basically, we thank you very much, panel. We've talked about cyber risk and digitization and so forth. There is actually, just so that everyone listening is aware, we have a digital risk certificate, which the Institute of Risk Management runs. Again, all of this kind of information alongside all the training courses that they provide are on the website, the IRM.org. Additionally, links will be added at a later date on this webinar. But basically, for example, we have the oil and gas training course as well, which is quite useful for all aspects of industry that are involved in oil and gas, whether it's construction or manufacturing, because we do look at projects, we look at supply chain, we look at all of these aspects. So anyone that's interested in training, you can find the various programs on www.theirm.org. You will also find the publication there. Does anyone on the panel want to raise anything else before we move on? Because Dominic will be talking about risk maturity very briefly as an example of some of the content in our report. Does anyone from the panel want to add anything or take a specific topic to discuss? I'm going to take that as a no, that we're quite happy to move on. So Rahat, Mark, Samuel, Grant, and Dominic, thank you very much for your insight on the panel discussion. We're going to move on now to Dominic, who was kind enough to contribute to the publication. We had about 10 various contributors who added about 1,500 word contributions that really provide a lot of insight into some risk topics which came up in the report. And some really interesting topics we had as well. It ranged from everything from risk appetite and key risk indicators to risk visualization, business continuity, and reputational risk. So one of those was moving up the risk maturity curve, which Dominic contributed, and we're hoping to just get a little bit of an insight into a sort of summary of what he captured in that report. So Dominic, over to you.
Thanks very much, Alexander. Well, I wanted to start off with purely positive points, and that is that compared to many other management systems that my research over the years have looked for, well, where are the researched hard economic benefits that you can sit in front of a CFO or CEO and say, this management system can deliver this to you. I haven't found too many for auditing, financial accounting, or other types of management systems that organisations use, but guess what? Over the last 15 years, there's plenty of evidence for that, for enterprise risk management and specifically for risk maturity. Now, in the survey, many oil and gas companies preferred ISO 31000. What many people perhaps don't realise is that if you read between the lines of the ISO 31000 standard, it actually implies its own risk maturity model with 15 capabilities grouped into 3 levels. And if any of the ONGs out there want to kickstart with a simple spreadsheet at no cost on a simple risk maturity model, then
Dominic,
there's
I'm
no
really sorry to interrupt you. We've just had a message come up from BrightTalk to say that this presentation is actually going to cut off in 40 seconds. I do apologise. So just to let you know.
Worries.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. In which case then, look for ISO 31000, look for what it calls foundation components, organisational arrangements, enhanced attributes, and you'll have 15 capabilities that you can self-rate. For cyber risk maturity, you can download for free. Google this, FFIEC risk maturity, and you will get a very good risk maturity model for cyber capabilities. They're my 2 recommendations for freebie ways to get going. Bye-bye.